run by central government. I'm just going to talk a bit about what the scheme is, how it works, how you can apply, and how you can be eligible for it. So just to start with, what is the energy company obligation? So the energy company obligation, which is known as ECO, is an energy efficiency scheme run by central government through energy suppliers. So essentially what it means is the government put an obligation on these energy suppliers, so people like British Gas and EDF and E.ON, that they have to be supporting vulnerable households by installing energy saving measures. So this means things like wall insulation, loft insulation, draft proofing. They also do boiler repairs and heating controls. And so this is all subsidised through energy bills, so it's free of charge to vulnerable households. And energy companies are required to deliver a certain number of measures over a 4-year period. So we're currently in the energy company obligation round 4. It's been running for 10 years so far. This is the 4th phase, which runs until 2026. So there's still quite a lot of time left of the scheme, but it's always good to know about these things ahead of time and to get in early. So that's why I'm talking to you today. Generally, the scheme is primarily managed by the energy suppliers. So we are kind of involved from a bit of a distance, but we are here to help you in terms of actually accessing the scheme and making sure that you can find out if you're eligible for it. So just to talk a bit about why we want to do energy efficiency and what actually the benefits of this are. So what's the point of installing these measures? Well, for a household, one of the main benefits is that it can really reduce your energy bills. So for example, loft insulation in a terraced house can save a household over £300 a year on their energy bills. It can also improve your comfort at home by reducing drafts and improving your warmth, making it just a nicer place to be throughout winter. It also, by making your home warmer, reduces the risk from cold-related illnesses. So we know that things like cold and flu, rates of that go up during winter, but also living in a cold home can be related to lots of really serious illnesses, particularly to do with the lungs and heart. So actually having a warmer home reduces your risk from these kinds of illnesses too. And then finally, by installing these kinds of measures, it should help reduce the amount of heat that is lost through the walls and windows of your homes, which should mean that you are able to use less energy and therefore it will reduce your bills, but also it will reduce the amount of carbon that you're emitting by heating your home. So it's really got benefits across the board, but in particular for households, it will be your home will be warmer, your energy bills should be lower, and there should be less risk of illness. So there's lots of point to doing these measures, but this is why we're trying to reach out to you and let you know. So in terms of actually what you need to have in order to be eligible for the scheme, so the first thing to be clear about is that ECO is generally set up to treat properties that currently are really inefficient. So we measure the efficiency of a home with a system called energy performance certificates, which use a rating that you can see on the right-hand side here. And this basically says whether your home is really good at kind of keeping the heat in and staying warm or really bad. And so an A rating is the most efficient home. So that's a home that retains its heat really well. And a G is a home that has probably quite leaky walls and windows and doesn't retain heat very well. And the energy company obligation scheme is set up to treat the lower half of this scale. So homes that are rated a D, E, F, or G. So that's the first criteria that you have to meet to be eligible for the scheme. And that's not based on anything to do with you or your family. That is just to do with the house that you live in. There is a database online where you can find your EPC to kind of check to make sure whether your house is in one of these categories, which I'll get to at the end as well. But the main thing to know is that these ratings are more common than you think. The average rating in the UK at the moment is a band D. So there's a very good chance that you could be in one of these categories. And if you do feel like your home is drafty and cold, then it's likely that you probably don't have the appropriate insulation, which would put you in one of these brackets. So that's the first thing to be aware of. Then more generally, there's two main ways to be eligible for the scheme. So there's the main scheme, which is the bit that's entirely run by energy suppliers. And that bit of the scheme is the eligibility is based on whether you receive certain benefits. So on the left-hand side here, you can see a list of all of the benefits that would make you eligible for the energy company obligation. You have to be in receipt of at least one of these, alongside your energy performance certificate being below a D or below, to be eligible. So if you receive these benefits, the best thing to do is to go through that main side of the scheme. The flexible eligibility side of the scheme is the bit that allows us to kind of expand that eligibility and target more people. And so there are different routes to eligibility under the flex scheme. So it can be based on the household income being below a certain level that you can see here. It can be based on a referral from a medical professional that says that you're particularly vulnerable to the effects of cold weather. For example, if you have certain illnesses, particularly related to your heart and lungs. And there are also lots of different proxies that we set as a council that say, actually, if you identify with any of these things, we think that you're likely to be eligible, and therefore we'll put you forward. And so one of the reasons that we've contacted you by your children's schools is because one of those proxies is families receiving free school meals. So that's something that we know does make people eligible for the flexible element of the scheme. But there are other things like if you're in receipt of a council tax reduction, or if you meet certain health guidelines. So the flexible scheme is just expanding it a little bit more broadly than just the benefits. And that part of the scheme is managed not by energy suppliers generally, although energy suppliers can support in it. It's mostly managed by local authorities, so the councils, us, and then local installers. So I'll talk a bit now about the kind of application process and how that works. So for the main scheme, the key thing is that it's managed by energy suppliers. So I've listed a few here, but there are tens of energy suppliers that are obligated on this. And there's a link here that shows you the full list and the full contact details. Most of the big names and most companies that I would expect you to be using as your energy supplier will be obligated in the scheme. So it's worth checking that out and making sure yours is on there. But also, if you are interested in applying through the scheme, it doesn't have to be through your own energy supplier. They're all obligated. They'll all want to be doing the works and making sure they can meet their targets. So you don't have to go through your own if you don't want to. But you can check with them to make sure that you are eligible and to discuss getting works done. So if you think you might be eligible for the main scheme, so if you're in receipt of any of those benefits we saw on the previous slide, it's really worth contacting your energy supplier and talking to them about your eligibility. A lot of them also do have application processes set up online. So I know that, for example, Octopus has an online portal that you can actually just go into and start your application there. And that can all be found through the supplier contact details. So just to so you know, any kind of links or things I refer in this, we will send out afterwards so you have access to those. On the flexible side of the scheme, that's managed more locally. So we as a council in Hammersmith and Fulham work with the National Energy Foundation. So they have a register of improved installers who all meet all of the requirements for the scheme. So there's quite a lot of standards that different installers have to meet to make sure that they'll carry out the works correctly and to make sure that they meet all the standards that are required by government. And so the National Energy Foundation have that list, and we have suppliers within our local area that are on that list that we can help getting you in touch with if you are interested in the flexible side of the scheme. And installers will be able to check your eligibility, and that will then be verified by us and the NEF, so the National Energy Foundation. And then they'll be able to carry out the works under ECO once they're agreed. Although obviously, if you have doubts or reservations, they'll also be able to answer questions on that. And there is no obligation to go through with works, even if you started having those conversations. So the main difference between the main scheme and the flex scheme is that the main scheme is very broad and covered by energy suppliers, whereas the flex scheme is much more local, and the council works to try and support residents in actually getting access to that. And it will be us that will sign off and say, yes, this person is eligible. But we do still have very strict guidelines and rules on who can be eligible, and what we can actually do to support. So all of the kind of rules that we've set out are published on our website. There'll also be a link to that provided following this session. So just to give you a kind of quick visual of what the process could look like. So on the left-hand side in the yellow, we've got what happens through the main scheme, and then a couple of edits on the right-hand side that show the difference in the flex scheme. But essentially, the customer contacts the supplier. The supplier will work with you to check their eligibility. So they might ask for evidence of that. So evidence that you receive certain benefits or evidence of your income. The supplier will then arrange for a retrofit assessment. So this is an assessment of your house. They'll come, they'll look around the house, see what insulation you already have, see what the kind of state of your walls, your loft is, your windows, so they can try and work out what measures might be suitable for your home. The resident will then get a set of recommendations of measures. They can choose whether to progress or not. At that point, they should also tell you what the cost of these is and the fact that they will be covering that. So the cost is less relevant, but it should give you all that full spread of information. And then if you do choose to progress, the supplier will put you in touch with a local installer to arrange that installation. And once you've got an installer, the work can begin. Depending on what you're having done, the time that takes can vary. But that's kind of the base step by step. Obviously, it will vary in certain scenarios. There might be more complexities depending on the type of property you live in, but that's a kind of general idea. And then on the flex side, if you're not eligible through the main scheme, you'll then come to us and we'll work with local installers to try and assign you someone who can check your eligibility, carry out that retrofit assessment and carry you through the process. So it's a very similar process. The difference is just that it would be through an installer rather than a supplier. So the suppliers being the big energy companies like British Gas, Octopus, and the installers being local construction workers who are trained in being able to deliver energy efficiency works. So that's a kind of base of what it might look like. Just a couple of points to be aware of. So we as a council don't have direct access to the funding, so it's managed by the obligated suppliers. So we'll support where possible, and the key thing I think is referring to local installers where needed. And then we're running sessions like this to make sure people are aware of the offer and know what it means. But we don't have direct access to the funding, so we are limited in what we can do here. It is important also to note that eligibility for eco doesn't necessarily mean that an energy supplier or an installer will decide to install them in your home. This is just a standard warning we have to give. It is fundamentally the choice of the energy company as to whether they do then go forward with funding that, because they will be the ones paying for that through the subsidies. But it's still very much worth going through the process and finding out, because generally it's mutually beneficial because they have targets to meet, and it will benefit you to get the work done. So it's definitely worthwhile. And then finally, do talk to people around you, your neighbours, friends, family, colleagues, anyone, because energy efficiency and these government funding schemes are complicated and they are difficult to understand, and it can be quite a daunting thing to have work done on your home when you don't necessarily know what it's going to entail. But you may actually find that there are people around you that have already been through a similar process, whether it's updating their loft insulation or getting some funding through a scheme for a new heating system. It's possible that you might know someone who's done it. So definitely do talk to people around you, neighbours, friends, family, whoever it may be, to see if you can get some more information on the ground, because it's always useful to have some kind of real world experience of people who've done this before. And then finally, this is just, and again, as I said, I'll make sure you get the links to this after the session, but this is just a few key links that should be useful to you if you are interested in applying. So Ofgem manages the scheme on the government's behalf, and you can find details on their website. So that's a link to there, and it has details specifically for homeowners, for tenants, for energy suppliers. It's got links to all of the different contacts at the different energy companies, so it's quite a useful page. I mentioned that you also need to have an energy performance certificate of a deal below. and you can actually check that online, and you can find out what the energy performance certificate is for your home. So there's a link to that as well. The Energy Savings Trust is a charity that provides free advice and information on energy efficiency and energy saving. And they include quite a lot of detailed information about the different measures that can be installed through a scheme like the Energy Company Obligation. So I just included that there because it's quite useful, and it gives you a rundown of things like what benefits you can expect in terms of bill reduction. But it also tells you kind of, how disruptive the building work might be. It tells you what you might want to expect once you've had the measure installed. So it's a very useful website. And then finally, I mentioned that the council have their kind of own version of how we plan to kind of check people's eligibility, but also what our criteria are for that. And so that's called our statement of intent. That's published on our website, but there's a link directly to that just here as well, so that you should be able to access that easily. And that is the end of my slides. So I will come back to the meeting.